All right, we're going to be reviewing the two threats to freedom, and these are really the two later steps of our paradox of free will. F2 says that if determinism is true, then we have no free will, and F3 says if determinism is false, then we have no free will. And together these imply that we don't have free will, assuming that determinism is either true or false. And that is part of what makes this a paradox, because boy, it seems like we do have free will. I gave brief motivations for both 2 and 3 last time as we were laying out the paradox. And in each case, it would be nice to have an argument as opposed to just sort of broadly gesturing at motivations for accepting 2 and 3. That's what we're going to do in this video. The reason I'm calling this the two threats to freedom is that one threat comes from determinism's truth, and the other threat comes from determinism's falsity. Specifically, the threat that arises if determinism is true is causation, or being causally determined in our actions and our decisions. And the threat that arises if determinism is false is randomness, that even if our actions are not caused or causally determined, maybe even precisely because they're not caused or causally determined, the result is that our actions and decisions are a matter of random chance, which also seems to undermine free will. Let's talk about the second step, the claim that if determinism is true, then there is no free will. For many of you, this may not need any further argument. You may just think it's obvious. Notice, though, that determinism is not defined as the claim that we have no free will. If indeed determinism is incompatible with free will, then it's not a matter of definition. And indeed, many philosophers have, over the millennia, and also certainly recently, many philosophers have been inclined toward compatibilism. The claim that, in fact, even if determinism is true, then we can still have free will. So we do need a little bit more of an argument for 2. And for an argument, this is really going to be a kind of crystallization, I think, of the intuition you may have that, well, something about determinism undermines freedom. We're going to turn to Peter Van Inwagen, and I had you read a short piece of his in which, among other things, he gives us a condensed and more accessible version of an influential argument for the claim that determinism is incompatible with free will, which he originally laid out in his 1983 book called An Essay on Free Will, sometimes called the consequence argument. Okay, here's what Van Inwagen says. If determinism is true, then our acts are the consequences of the laws of nature and events in the remote past. But it is not up to us what went on before we were born, and neither is it up to us what the laws of nature are. Therefore, the consequences of these things, including our present acts, are not up to us. So this is a distillation of his consequence argument. The version that we get in the piece we read is a little simpler, a little more accessible than the original statement. We're going to use this idea following Van Inwagen of an unalterable fact is really at the core of this argument. Let's say that an unalterable fact is a fact that no human being in history could ever have done anything to change. So, for example, the fact that the Earth is round, the fact that magnets attract iron, the fact that if a number is less than 5, then that number is less than 6. The fact that there were dinosaurs 65 million years ago. These are all facts, not just that it's hard to change, nor are these facts that if only we had more information or were a little stronger, we could change them. Instead, these all seem to be facts that are fixed and unchangeable by anybody. No matter how much more information or knowledge we had or how much more time, we could never change the fact that if a number is less than 5, then it's less than 6. It's a mathematical truth that we just have no control over, and nor has anyone ever had any ability to make any different. Van Inwagen notes that the notion of what he calls an untouchable, we're calling unalterable fact, has a certain logic to it. One of the principles of this logic is, so he says, embodied in the following thesis, which I shall refer to simply as the principle. We're going to follow him in referring to it as this. Suppose it's an unalterable fact that P, and suppose also that the following conditional or if-then statement expresses an unalterable fact. If P, then Q. It follows from these two suppositions that it's an unalterable fact that Q. So here's the principle. This is according to Van Inwagen, a plausible, logical principle that governs what we can conclude when we know something about unalterability. If it's an unalterable fact that P, and it's an unalterable fact that if P then Q, then it's an unalterable fact that Q. Notice that this has a similar structure to an argument form that we've encountered before, which is modus ponens, which goes as follows: P, if P then Q, therefore Q. Principle is not modus ponens. It looks like it, but it is importantly different. Why? Well, it has this additional, sometimes called an operator or phrase in front of the P's and Q's, which is it's an unalterable fact that. And that phrase has meaning, and that means that modus ponens, although valid, doesn't mean that principle is necessarily valid. I'm going to take for granted that it is valid. Much of the subsequent debate in the literature on free will after Van Inwagen's publication of that book centered around whether principle is a valid logical form. If you're interested in that, you should check that out. But for our purposes, we're going to assume that this is a good principle. What it tells us is that we have no ability to alter the necessary consequences of facts that we can't alter. That's what basically principle tells us. Here is the basis. We're going to use that as the basis of an argument. This is sometimes called the consequence argument for the conclusion that if determinism is true, then we have no free will. Now, one thing that's really important is that determinism is playing a role in this argument as a background assumption. The way to think about this argument is, let's start by assuming that determinism is true. And then what we'll do is reason from determinism's truth to the conclusion that we have no free will. If we can do that successfully, then determinism's truth implies that we have no freedom. And so if determinism is true, then we have no free will. So although determinism doesn't play an explicit role in any of the premises, you can think of it as playing an implicit role as a background assumption. Here is the argument. Okay, with that in mind. Pick some random fact about yourself that it sure seemed before coming to philosophy class, it sure seemed to you as though you had the power to change. This could be the fact that you're a UCF student. Sure seemed like at some point you had the ability to alter that fact, namely when you were deciding whether to go to UCF. Or take the fact that you're now watching this video. At some point you made the decision, I'm going to open up web courses and click on the links. You didn't have to, at least that's the way it seemed. And so it seems that you at some point were in the position to alter the fact that you are now watching this video. The conclusion of the argument is, therefore, it is an unalterable fact that you are now watching this video. Or I'm going to run with the version we did in class. Slot in any action or any decision you've ever made as your conclusion. Therefore, it is an unalterable fact, for example, that I'm now in philosophy class. That is our conclusion. C1, the first premise, says this. It's an unalterable fact that the state of the world 65 million years ago was S. Okay, what does that say? What that tells us is you have no ability, nor have you ever, nor has anyone else ever had the ability to change what the state of the world was 65 million years ago. S is just a name for all of the details of the many objects and all their properties 65 million years ago. Because we can't spell them out, of course, we're just going to give that a name, just like we did with collection C when we were discussing the cosmological argument. We just said, let's call that C. That's what we're doing here. It's an unalterable fact that the state of the world in 65 million BCE was S. That seems really plausibly true. All that tells us is you couldn't have changed anything about the way the world was 65 million years ago, nor could any other human, because there were no humans. Here's the second step. It's an unalterable fact that if the state of the world 65 million years ago was S, then I'm now in philosophy class. What this tells us is it is an unalterable fact that the way the state of the world was 65 million years ago, implicitly, and the way the laws of nature were, gives rise as a necessary consequence to the fact that I'm now in philosophy class. So the unalterable fact is a conditional fact. If the state of the world 65 million years ago was S, then I'm now in philosophy class. This is effectively telling us that it's an unalterable fact that determinism is true. So I mentioned that determinism's truth is playing a role. The role it's playing is that we are assuming that it is the case that if the state of the world 65 million years ago was S, then I would now be in philosophy class. In other words, we're assuming that there's only one possible output state for each input state of the world at any given time. And then C2 is adding to that. Furthermore, determinism's truth is something over which you have no control. You have never had the power to change the fact that determinism is true, if it's true, assuming it is. Both of these seem really plausible. If determinism's true, I can't change the fact that determinism's true. And furthermore, I have no ability to alter the fact that the state of the world 65 million years ago was as it was. It follows given principle that it's an unalterable fact that I'm sitting here in philosophy class. Or slot in your favorite example. Because we began with the assumption that determinism is true, we can conclude that if determinism is true, then it's an unalterable fact that I'm in philosophy class now. Okay, let's just pause to talk about what that means. Remember, an unalterable fact is a fact that no human being could ever have done anything to change. What this conclusion basically tells us is if determinism is true, then no one could have ever done anything to change the fact that I'm in philosophy class now, including me. I was never in a position to change the fact that I would inevitably be in philosophy class. It may have seemed that I was, but I was not. Why is this relevant to free will? Recall the ability to do otherwise condition. That condition says someone does something freely at a time only if they could have done otherwise than that thing at the time. You count as free when you steal something only if you could have not stolen. If you weren't, say, being coerced, if you weren't being mind controlled, if you weren't doing the stealing as a result of a compulsion, those things would all mean that you couldn't have done otherwise. So if determinism is true, then I have no ability to do otherwise with respect to coming to philosophy class. That was the only thing I ever could have done. And so it follows from that if determinism is true, then I'm not in philosophy class right now of my own free will. Of course, there's nothing special about that particular action. Slot in any other action of yours, or anyone else's for that matter, and what you get from the consequence argument is the conclusion that if determinism is true, then no one's actions ever have been free. Why? Because no one could ever have done anything other than what they actually do. Why? Because no one's actions were ever alterable facts. That's what the consequence argument shows us, if determinism is true. So that is the consequence argument in defense of F2. In short, we have no ability to change the necessary consequences of facts that we have no ability to change. And if determinism is true, then our actions and decisions are all necessary consequences of factors that we have no ability to change, namely the distant past and the laws of nature. So it follows that we have no ability to change our own actions, so they're not free, if determinism is true. Now, why think that if determinism is false, then we have no free will? You might be like, well, the answer is just to reject determinism, and I can keep my freedom. We discussed A.J. Ayer. He's not the only one to make this point, but he articulates it pretty well. A.J. Ayer, who is a compatibilist, by the way, he says this: either it's an accident that I choose to act as I do, or it is not. If it is an accident, then it is merely a matter of chance that I did not choose otherwise. And if it is merely a matter of chance that I did not choose otherwise, it is surely irrational to hold me morally responsible for choosing as I did. But if it is not an accident, then we are led back to determinism. Here it seems that by accident he means lacking a deterministic cause. He says, if my actions lack a deterministic cause, then it's just a matter of chance whether I do those actions. We could say the same for my choices or decisions. Here's the conclusion of the argument. Slot in some action over which it seemed to you that you had control. That is, some action it seemed to you you were free with respect to. Suppose that you had at some point made a decision to tell a lie that you shouldn't have and look back and regret it. Probably seems to you like, boy, I could have done something else. I was free when I made that decision. It's part of why I regret it. Furthermore, you might think I had control over what I did there. It's part of why I was responsible. The conclusion of what we'll call the randomness argument is that if determinism is false, then you have no control over whether you decided to lie. The first premise is this: if determinism is false, then it's a matter of random chance whether you, or I'll put it in the first person, I, decide to lie. The second premise is I have no control over what's a matter of random chance. So let's focus for a second on this first premise. If determinism is false, then it is a matter of random chance whether I decide to lie or not. Let's, in our mind's eye, go back to this time, whether it's fictional or not, sometime when you told a lie, or where, let's say I told a lie, and where it seemed to me that I could have done either one, and I just had control, whether to lie or tell the truth. I had complete control over which way things went. That's at least the way it felt. Now let's add to that determinism is false. And let's specifically imagine that it's false in this circumstance where I'm deciding whether to lie or tell the truth. In other words, the state of the past, all the way up until this moment I'm making this hard decision, all the way up until the moment that I make the decision, the state of the world in the past, including facts about me, my own preferences, my own psychology, and so on, and the laws of nature do not determine which way I'll go. So here's me, or you, trying to decide whether to lie. What we're assuming is that determinism is false, and so there are two possible futures consistent with the laws of nature and the past up into that moment. One, where you decide not to lie. The other, where you decide to lie. That's what is required for determinism to be false. Let's imagine that you actually decided not to lie. Let's imagine you decided not to lie. Van Inwagen, again, helpfully paints this picture. Our character Alice, who's you or me, I guess we've got three people going now, you, me, or Alice. Suppose that immediately after Alice told the truth, God caused the universe to revert to precisely its state 1 minute before Alice told the truth. Let us call the first moment the universe was in this state T1, and the second moment the universe was in this state T2. And then let things go forward again. So let's imagine that God reverses the state of the world back into the moment that Alice was trying to decide what to do, and then let things go forward again. What would have happened the second time? Van Inwagen asks us. So this is the rollback intuition. Well, if determinism is really false, then we don't know. nor would an omniscient being be able to predict what Alice is going to do on the first rollback. Because again, nothing in Alice's brain, nothing in her history, nothing in the outside pressures guarantee one way or the other what things she's going to do at the next moment. So if we roll back things, we don't know what she'll do. We can, though, imagine in our mind's eye that we press play, and suppose this time she decides, I'm going to lie, right? Van Inwagen says, okay, so we've now got one case, how things actually played out, where Alice thought about whether to lie, decided not to lie. God then reverses time and presses pause right when Alice is making that decision, and then presses play. And the second time, because determinism's false, she decides to lie. That wouldn't be possible if determinism were true, but we're assuming determinism's false. Van Inwagen says, now let's suppose that God 1,000 times caused the universe to revert to the state that it was originally in. That is when she's making this decision. What would have happened? What should we expect to observe over the course of these 1,000 rollbacks? Well, again, we can't say for sure what would have happened, but we can say what probably would have happened. Sometimes Alice would have lied, and sometimes she would have told the truth. As the number of replays increases, we observers shall almost certainly observe the ratio of outcome truth to outcome lie settling down to converging upon some value. And specifically over time, if this is a truly non-deterministic process, and there are two possible output states, over time, more and more and more rollbacks and replays, you will begin to get the ratio of decisions to lie to decisions not to lie to come out to about 50% each, or 0.5. So on the second rollback and replay, maybe she decides to lie. But then roll back and replay number 3, she decides to lie. And you keep repeating this, and you get either a kind of bouncing back and forth, or maybe you get 5 in a row where she decides not to lie, and then 6 in a row where she decides to lie. But over time, the values will converge on about a ratio of 50-50. And that's just basically a lot like it being a matter of random chance, which of the two she decides to do. So that is all a way of supporting this claim that if determinism's false, then it's a matter of random chance, whether or not I decide to lie or Alice decides to lie. Here's the second premise. I have no control over what's a matter of random chance. Why think this? The simplest version is just imagine that you're doing a fair coin flip. Imagine it really is fair. And so it's not weighted or something. No one has any real control over what's going to happen because it's fair. Surely you have no control, therefore, over whether the coin comes up heads or tails. I mean, if you did, then probably it wasn't fair, right? So that suggests that if something is truly a matter of random chance, then no one has any control over the outcome. Here's a more fanciful case, our friend Brock from The Paradox of Free Will. We initially had Brock in case 5 was being mind controlled by a mad scientist. And the mad scientist was pressing a button, and the button caused him to decide to stay in the room. I'm changing it a little bit, and we have a safe in the room, and our friend Brock is deciding to steal. He has a device hooked up to him by the mad scientist. This device, though, works a little differently. We call this the random decision generator. What happens is that when the mad scientist presses the button, the random decision generator has a 50% chance of causing Brock to steal and a 50% chance of causing Brock to decide to just leave and not steal. I ask you to consider whether, if Brock reaches down and steals, and if that decision is a result of a random output of this random decision generator plugged into his brain, whether we could realistically hold him accountable, or in other words, whether he had any control over whether he stole. I mean, the thought is he could just have easily decided not to steal. And it seems like nothing he did, nothing he could have done, determines or causes him to do one rather than the other, because it is a matter of complete random chance which thing happens. That suggests that if we don't want to say he is in control, then neither is, say, Alice in control when she decides to lie or not, even though she doesn't have a random decision generator hooked up to her. She has, so to speak, the past and the laws of nature leading her to a moment of complete indeterminacy in her brain. And that moment of complete indeterminacy in her brain functions analogously of robbing her of her free will as the random decision generator functions to rob Brock here of his free will. So it follows from what we've said then that if determinism is false, then you had no free will when you lied or not, and nor did anyone actually have any free will doing anything that they did, because they didn't have any control over it. It was just random. That completes our more detailed defense of the two opposing threats to freedom: the threat from causal determinism and the threat from randomness. This leaves us with a lot of pressure to think maybe we don't have free will. And in the next video, we'll talk about Dirk Pereboom, who says we have no free will, and the second part of his title is "And How We Can Live Without It." So he wants to convince you that actually it's not that bad to give up free will. So we'll talk about that next time.